It's good to have everybody here. Well, we are good, okay? Well, we're going to look at some very interesting chapters in Deuteronomy, chapters beginning 16 to 18. So if you have your Bible, just go there, 16 to 18. This begins a portion of the Jewish readings in the synagogue in this day. These Jewish readings that divide the book into several portions. It begins a new reading called actually Shoftim, which means in Hebrew judges. So that's the title of this reading, and it goes actually all the way to chapter 29, verse 9. So it's a very long reading. Chapter 21, verse 9. But long passage. I don't think we can in half an hour talk about everything. So this section that we call Judges, or the Hebrews, the Israelites call Judges, we're going to start reading from the English Standard Version, verse 18, chapter 16. Of course, this is Deuteronomy. They're not entered the land yet. These are regulations for when they will be entering the land, what they need to do, and follow the rules they need to follow. It's all about their life and what they need to do once they're in the land. So Moses is speaking, God is speaking through Moses. You shall appoint judges and officers in all your towns that the Lord your God is giving you, according to your tribes, and they shall judge the people with righteous judgment. So we have two categories of individuals. We have the judges. These are the courts people. These are the actual judges. And then we have officers, which we probably, the easiest way to understand officers is police. And they're the police, basically. So that you have an organization of life based on a police corps that are looking over how people are doing bad things or good things, and then you have judges, and they kind of work together. So when they enter the land, it's not going to be each man for himself making his own rules and those laws. That's hard to live in a society like that, because there are societies even today where there's no such organization, and so everybody does his own thing, tries to protect himself, and from whatever could happen to him. But it's better to live in a system that's organized, and that's what God wanted for these people. So the towns here, the word towns here is actually in Hebrew, the word is gates. So it's the gated cities. These are usually the larger towns. The gated towns are larger towns. But they had certain rules. For example, traditionally, if the town was very small, they needed to have at least 3 judges. If the town was larger, then they had 23 judges. It goes all the way to the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin is in Jerusalem, maybe in the time of Jesus. That's kind of like a court of justice, had 70 judges. So different numbers of judges depending on the size of the town or the city. But obviously what's important is that they shall judge with righteous judgment. And so let's read that. It's important. You shall not pervert justice. You shall not show partiality. And you shall not accept a bribe. For a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and subverts the cause of the righteous. Justice, and only justice, you shall follow, that you may live and inherit the land that the Lord your God is giving you. So it's very important that the justice be done right way. So without they should not show partiality. Maybe we can look at several verses. Maybe, for example, let's look at Leviticus 19. Leviticus 19, verse 15. I think we have something on that here. Right. Leviticus 19, verse 15. You shall do no injustice in court. You shall not be partial to the poor or defer to the great, but in righteousness shall you judge your neighbor. So what it's talking about here is mainly that just because people are poor doesn't mean they cannot have justice done to them, or just because people are rich doesn't mean that they should just do whatever they want. So impartial, That's perfect for even for today. That's ideal. And of course, no bribes. Now, you know that in the law, not here, but in Exodus, we're going to look at a passage. We know this principle of an eye and a tooth for a tooth. Just look at that. Let's look at that verse, and I want to say a few things on that. Exodus 21, 22. Exodus chapter 21. Let's look at Exodus chapter 21. I have a hard time turning the page of this Bible. I don't know why. And so let's look at these verses here to understand a little bit what an eye and a tooth and tooth, what it means really. So we have an example here, Exodus 21, verse 22. When men strive together and hit a pregnant woman, so that her children come out, but there's no harm, the one who hit her shall surely be fined, as the woman's husband shall impose on him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. But if there is harm, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for tribe. So there's much more than eye for eye, tooth for tooth. But you notice the context here of this statement, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. It's in the context of a judgment, of a court. And you see that in verse 22. And he shall pay as the judges determine. So eye for eye, tooth for tooth is not, like many people think, a personal thing. If somebody does this to me, I'm going to do that back to them. A lot of people understand that like that. It's not. It's in the context of having a court, and there were judges in every town, every tribe, and it's in context of something has been done, you go to court, and then it's the judge that decides, and it's going to be eye for eye, tooth for tooth. It's not going to be if somebody loses an eye, then the other person loses their life. You know, or so it has to be impartial. It has to be exactly so that people are not punished more or less than what they are to be. Now, it's not a perfect thing, but at least it allows so that there's not abuse and exaggeration in punishment or lack of punishment. So it's interesting, I think, to talk about that. So this is the first thing we see in there. Immediately after talking about these judges and these officers that are to check, how things are going and how to have these courts, immediately after that the law mentions idolatry, beginning in verse 21, and there's a lot of things that say about that. Abominations, different things that they should not do, like serve other gods. Verse 3, serve the sun or the moon, practice things, like that are not allowed, that are practiced by other nations, occult, and all these different things. I think the reason that's mentioned there immediately after talking about judges is because to show that these judges and in Israel, these judges and these officers were to check that there was no idolatry brought into the land, and that it had a religious tone to it, okay? It was not just about murder and things like that, it was also about idolatry. God made it very clear not to have these idols and not to practice these things. One reason for that is that foreigners, sojourners, were allowed to come into the country if they needed to. They could come into the country, but there were conditions. And one condition for them to come into the country was that they were to be faithful to the covenant. They were not to bring in their idols and their practices. So God was checking that, and that's very important that they did that. So that's an important thing. Another thing we find then following in chapter 17 is the concept of, always in the case of a court, that in order to accuse somebody or condemn somebody, you need to have 2 or 3 witnesses. One person is not enough. That's chapter 17, verse 6. On the evidence of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses, the one who is to die shall be put to death. A person shall not be put to death on the evidence of 1 witness. So 1 person is not enough to condemn somebody. If you look at chapter 19, I believe, 19 later on, and verse, where is it? 25, I believe, if I'm not mistaken. No, it's not here. I don't know where it is. Oh yeah, 19 verse 15, actually. So a single witness shall not suffice against a person for any crime or for any wrong in connection with any offense that he has committed. On the evidence of 2 witnesses or 3 witnesses shall a charge be established. So it's impossible to have one person accuse a person of something and have that person condemned for that. If there's just one witness, it's not enough. You need to have 2 or 3. Oh, that's important. And then continuing to talk about these judges that are going to be established, these courts, and so that things are regulated that way. There's a kind of a court system. Then we have, beginning in chapter 17, verse 8, the case of where cases are more complex, more difficult. And so then it's like, if you read it, we're not going to go through it, but there's going to be another court, which you might compare to the Supreme Court a little bit. In a place that God has established, going to be in Jerusalem, obviously. That's where we begin to have we get the Sanhedrin from that Supreme Court, where cases like that are brought there. So that's chapter 17, verse 8. Verse 9, you shall come to the Levitical priest, to the judges who is in office in those days. That's another level of court of judges in case we're not able to solve these issues, because sometimes these issues can be very, very difficult, very complex. And I mean, the law of Moses is great, but obviously it's not going to be perfection. There's going to be mistakes. There's going to be errors, because human people make mistakes. There can be false witnesses and all that. We can always take that and say, yeah, well, what about this? What about this? That's true. But I don't think any system of law, wherever you live, is perfect. You're not going to get that, because we live in an imperfect world with imperfect people. So I don't think we can expect the law to solve everything. Because then what happens, I think if we expect the law to solve everything, then what we're going to do is multiply laws, and it doesn't help. We have that problem, I think, in our Western countries, Western world, that inflation of laws. Probably France is number 1, I think. They're number 1 in inflation of law. They make laws every day. Nobody knows what the laws are, but there's so many of them. So you cannot regulate people's lives just through laws. And I think that's important, because it helps us understand that the real solution is not there. To get people to behave the way they should, the real solution is for people to have a change of heart. And that's why in other passages, like here in other passages, God says, circumcise your heart. That's what God wants. He would like for everybody to understand his will and to live by his will without having policemen behind to tell them you're doing wrong, or judges, or fear of court. It's the ideal for a society. That's why we need to preach the gospel. That's why we need to go into all the world and preach the gospel, because when we do that, society changes. Because people's hearts changes, people's behavior changes, and peace comes, better understanding comes, and it's great. It's the gospel that does that. Laws cannot do that. But still, it's good to know what God was doing with Israel, with these laws. Okay, so it continues in chapter 17, and now he's interesting, because here he establishes certain principles whenever they're going to have a king. Now, it's surprising, because when we read that, it's almost like God is telling them to have a king. Some people believe that. Say, well, that's strange. It's like God is telling them to have a king, because we know later in Samuel that God didn't want that. But it doesn't say that. This is prophetical. This is when they're going to enter the land. God knows they're going to have a king. And here are some of the things that the king, they should know about the king. So, verse 14, when you come to the land that the Lord your God is giving you, and you possess it and dwell in it, and then say, I will set a king over me like all the nations that are around me. That's exactly what they did. God knew ahead that they would ask for that. So they asked for a king later on. It's in 1 Samuel chapter 8, actually, under Samuel, who was a judge and a prophet. That's when they asked for a king, the first king being Saul. Though they want to be like a king. So God says, you may indeed set a king over you, whom the Lord your God will choose. One from among your brothers you shall set as king over you. And he says, you may not put a foreigner over you who is not your brother. That's an important thing, because here is a principle that's given. It has to be an Israelite. It has to be from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. It cannot be a foreigner. And we'll see the same thing about the prophet, that Moses says there's going to be a prophet like me, has to be an Israelite to be that prophet that's going to be like Moses. But we'll see that later. What about some of these things about this? Well, he should not be a foreigner? Okay, what about that? He must not acquire many horses for himself, okay, or the people, to return to Egypt to acquire horses. He shall not acquire many wives for himself, verse 17. He shall not acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. So we see how God is putting limitations on the king and showing how the king has to behave. And the king has to give account. The king is not all powerful. The king is not a god. Remember that in Egypt, the Pharaoh was God, basically. He was worshipped as a god. He could do whatever he wanted. Same thing in the Roman Empire. The emperors were worshipped as God. People worshiped them. God doesn't want that. No ruler can be worshipped. No ruler is God. No ruler has total authority to do whatever they want. They have to give account to God. That's an important principle, even valid today. Of course, even valid today. So, when he sits on the throne, he shall write for himself, verse 18, in the book, a copy of this law. So that's important here. The king should always be looking at the law. Whenever he does anything or he makes a decision, he's got to be in the Word. He's got to decide on the basis of the Word. And also, verse 20, his heart should not be lifted up above his brothers, should not become proud, etc. All of these different things about the king. And then we enter a new subject in Deuteronomy 18 now, chapter 18, and that's concerning the Levites and the priests. Well, basic principle that we have here, chapter 18, concerning the Levites and the people who are from that tribe, who work in the tabernacle, who take care of these sacrifices and all this religious life of Israel. Well, they're not to inherit any land in the country. They don't have the tribe of Levi doesn't have land like the other tribes, and they are to live, eat, and live, being supported by the other tribes because they're going to give themselves fully to that work. Now that's a principle that we find in some places, even the New Testament, to talk about in the church, that the church can support people to evangelize or teach full time. It's a biblical principle. It's something that can be done. And so we have an example here in the Old Testament, and we have an example in the New Testament. So that's not a problem. Okay, let's go into something very interesting. I think it's chapter 18, verse 9. So here, and there's a number of those, not just in Deuteronomy, but other books like Leviticus, warnings about the practices they're going to find in the other lands, and that they should avoid. That's their problem. The problem is they're going to get into a land where people practice all kinds of different things, and so they're going to have to be really watching themselves not to adapt to the culture and to the ways of these people. Verse 9, when you come into the land that the Lord your God is giving you, you shall not learn to follow the abominable practices of the nations. And so here's a number of them. I think there are 8 or 9 of them. You shall not burn your son or your daughter as an offering, which many people practiced in the ancient world. For example, the god Moloch required children, sometimes babies, to be offered to this god so they would be well, their harvest would go well. That's what the gods wanted. Well, God didn't want that, okay? You shall not practice divination or tell fortunes or interpret omens or a sorcerer or a medium or necromancer. All these are different terms to talk about people practicing occult practices. Necromancer is the one who supposedly who can communicate with the dead to tell you what's going on, what you should do or not. So there's different kinds of things that still exist today and have always existed, these practices. And he says, for whoever does these things is an abomination to the Lord. And because of these abominations, the Lord your God is driving them out before you. Let's look at another passage where the word abomination is used. And I want to talk about that word, what it means exactly, because it has a specific meaning in Hebrew. It's important to know what it means. But let's look at Leviticus 18 and verse 22. All right, Leviticus 18. We find a number of these, but this is another example. And there are a number of things here. Verse 21, Leviticus 18, is the same thing that is mentioned in Deuteronomy about the children being offered to the gods, for example. And you shall not give any of your children to offer them to Molech, and so profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. It's an abomination. You shall not lie with an animal to make yourself unclean with it. Those talk about sexual practices, which are called an abomination. The word abomination is the Hebrew word pigul, and it means stinking. I never heard anybody say that. When you go into the Hebrew, it means it stinks. It's foul. That's what the word actually means. It's a very strong word. So it's interesting to see that because can be translated refuse. I can even use a bad word in English that I'm not going to use. That's what it is. That's exactly how God looks at it. So that's a very strong word, and when you read abomination in English, you don't get it like that, but it's very, very strong language. So this is the strongest word, actually, that is used, I think, in the whole Bible to talk about God's displeasure. It's the strongest word. He doesn't like these practices that are mentioned here. Okay, so that's interesting. So let's look at something else now, a little more positive maybe. It's in chapter 18, the new prophet like Moses. So it's a beautiful text where God is saying that there's going to be a time when another prophet will come that's going to be like Moses. And it's important to note that, like Moses. And it's a prophecy. Now in Islam, they believe and they teach that prophet is Muhammad. That's the prophet. They know the text. They think that's Muhammad. Well, look at the text and see a little bit how that would fit Jesus. So in chapter 18, verse 15, let's look at it. We read in verse 15, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brothers. First thing. The prophet like Moses is an Israelite. Cannot be Muhammad. So that's an important thing, okay? And it's to him you shall listen. They have to listen to this prophet. And verse 18 again, I will raise up a prophet like you from among their brothers, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. So it's similar to Moses. This prophet is coming. Well, who is this prophet? Who is he? Let's look at a few verses in the book of John to begin with. In John chapter 1, we have the religious leaders coming to John who is baptizing, and they ask him an interesting question. John. I have a hard time turning the pages of this Bible. I don't know why. John 1:21, I believe. Yeah, the religious leaders are coming to John and asking him some questions. They ask him, what then are you? Are you Elijah? And John said, I'm not. And they say, are you the prophet? And he answered, no. So when they say, are you the prophet, who do they mean? They mean this prophet from Deuteronomy 18, that God was going to send a prophet like Moses. That's what they're expecting, a prophet like Moses. Are you that one? John Baptist says, no, I am not. He's pretty clear on that. John 1:45, just a little bit further down. There we go. Here's an interesting passage here. Philip found Nathanael and said to him, we have found him of whom Moses in the law and also the prophets rose, Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. So here he says specifically the one whom Moses in the law and the prophets wrote. So in the law he wrote about this one coming, and he says this one is Jesus of Nazareth, the son of Joseph. If we look at John chapter 6 later on, just John 6, where after Jesus has multiplied the bread and the fish, 6:14, chapter 6, verse 14, we see that how the people react after he multiplied the bread and the fishes. He provided bread for them, okay? What's the reaction? Verse 14, when the people saw the sign that he had done, what did they say? This is indeed the prophet who is to come into the world. There again, the prophet. Now, remember, Moses prayed to God, and God sent what? Bread, manna. So we have Jesus doing that. Now, there are a number of things. it says here that he's going to be a prophet like Moses. Let's think about that a little bit. Maybe we'll have enough time for that. Let's think about that a little bit and compare Moses to Jesus. Let's think a little. If we can put Moses on one side and Jesus on another side, how many similarities there are? Many, many. Number one, Moses is an Israelite. Okay? So is Jesus. That's important. Okay. Moses was born under a foreign king, Pharaoh. Jesus was born under a foreign king because Herod was not an Israelite. He was an Idumean, put there by the Romans. In fact, he was born under Roman rule. Okay? Moses grew up under foreign rulers, of course, Egypt. So did Jesus, the Romans. He grew up as a child under foreign rulers. Okay? Moses was rejected. You remember that Moses wanted to liberate the Israelites? He wanted to free them from Egypt. What happened? They rejected him. He went into the wilderness. Same thing with Jesus. They rejected him. Moses was criticized by his family members. At some point, Aaron even and Miriam criticized him. What about Jesus? Was Jesus criticized by his family? Sure was. He sure was. Moses was a teacher. Jesus was a teacher. Moses prayed so God would bring bread from heaven. Jesus multiplied the bread, like we saw. Moses is called the shepherd of Israel. Moses was a shepherd for 40 years. Good training, yeah? With real sheep. Well, Jesus is called what? The good shepherd. Good. Moses fasted 40 days in the wilderness. That's important. Before receiving the law, what did Jesus do? After his baptism? Fasted 40 days in the wilderness. Moses is called, even in the Old Testament, a mediator between God and the people. What is Jesus? Mediator between God and the people. Moses, even at some point, offered to die for the people so the people would be spared by God. He did. I'll give my life. God said, no, you don't have to. Jesus, too, offered his life for the people. The law was given to Moses on Mount Sinai 50 days after they left Egypt. So what did Jesus say to his apostles in Acts chapter 1? To wait in Jerusalem. How long? 50 days. Until the coming of the Spirit, the new covenant, the new law. So you see, there are a lot of things like that. What else can we say? Moses, when he came down from the mountain, his face was shining. Is there something like that with Jesus? Yes. The transfiguration. His face was shining. Okay, so it says that. Okay. Moses lifted up the serpent, the brazen serpent, when the people rebelled against God so they could be healed. Jesus talked about that. John chapter 3 and John chapter 12 and John chapter 3 says, just like the serpent was raised, I will be raised like the serpent. That's where he says that God so loved the world that he gave his only son. It's right after that. So that's also here. When the Israelites came out of Egypt, the Amalekites came, the enemies, and what did Moses do when they were fighting? What was he doing? You remember? Does that remind you something about Jesus? Interesting. His arms were extended when they were fighting the Amalekites. What about Jesus on the cross? He was fighting the devil on the cross. So that's interesting too. Oh, there's a lot of things. How many spies did were sent by Moses in the land?